Sometimes designing something in Photoshop and Illustrator can be really difficult, and the hardest part of the process a lot of times is just figuring out what it should even look like, where to start with designing whatever you're trying to design. One thing that can really help the entire process is sketching. And yes, I'm talking about with a pencil and paper. Doing this on paper frees you up from the limitations that Illustrator and Photoshop gives you. You can kind of get tunnel vision if you start designing directly in the programs without thinking about how the object should look and just start making stuff up as you go. If you start by sketching out ideas on paper, you're not constraining yourself to the tools that you have in those two programs. Whatever you think of in your head, you can draw. And I'm talking about quick, dirty, rough sketches. You do not have to be an amazing illustrator by hand. And I, by no means, consider myself to be a professional illustrator, a talented illustrator, or even a pretty good illustrator. I am terrible at drawing by hand. But I can still get my ideas out through the pencil onto the paper, and it's so much quicker than trying to make something with the pen tool or brushing something out in Photoshop. When you're just quick and dirty drawing something on paper, it's so much faster. So in this lesson, I'm going to walk you through my entire process of generating an idea, coming up with something that I want to make, and then sketching out a bunch of different versions of it on paper to get my creative juices flowing and seeing how this object could be represented in a bunch of different styles. Picking one of those sketches, refining it, bringing it into the computer, and then digitally recreating it. So we're going to be kind of going all over the place in this lesson, but it's all going to start online. I need to find some references of the object that I want to draw. And I've decided that I want to draw a Vespa or a motor scooter of some kind. So what I'm going to do now is go to Pinterest, which if you've never used before is just a great way to organize lots of reference images. You can create a board where you're just pinning a bunch of photos or illustrations, whatever the image is, and collecting them into one central location for easy reference. So I'm going to start by just typing out Vespa and seeing what comes up. There we go. We've got tons of different objects. The first thing I'm thinking about when I'm looking at all these reference images is the angle. I'm going to be using one of these images as a reference for my sketches. So if we take a look at maybe this one right here, you can see that all of the scooters are directly like a profile view from the side. So that's one angle I could go with. But then there's, an angle like this that's more from the front. It might be a little bit harder to identify what it is if I were to sketch it in this way. I'm just going to keep scrolling and quickly glance across these photos and try and find one that pops out to me as a good angle to draw it at. This one's interesting. I like it because it's more of a 3/4 angle view, so you can see a lot more depth to the photo and to the scooter itself. So I'm going to go ahead and save that one. I'll click on save, and then I need to make a new board. So I'm just going to call this Vespa and click create, and that way that is collected in a new board, and I can now add as many photos as I want to that board and reference it later on. Now as I scroll down here, you can see that it brought up a lot of similar images. It says more like this, so I can very quickly see a lot of other photos that are very similar. This one's pretty interesting. I'm just going to click save, put that on Vespa. This one's a pretty cool angle too. I'll do that to the same board. Oh, this one's really cool. So another thing that I'm looking for is details. Like this has this really cool grill on the front. It might be for like mounting something on the front of your scooter. So seeing those reference details are things that I could potentially include in my sketches. So I'm going to save that one for sure. This one is very cool. I love the contrast between the green and the white, and then that leather seat. All details that I may or may not include in my final piece, but I'm going to put that in my reference. And you can see just how quickly I can jump from one photo to the next on Pinterest and just find more and more reference images. And like this one has 2 seats. Like I never would have thought about that on a Vespa, but there you go. I've got 2 seats. Maybe that's a feature I could include in my sketches. All right, I'm going to go back to my main search and see if I can find anything else. This one's very cool. I love how that bag is mounted in the front there. And this old-timey light on the front is also really cool. I'm going to save that. This is another really nice one. I'll save that. And look, this actually looks like it has another angle, so I'm going to do that just in case I want to try something different. You keep on scrolling. This one's a lot of fun. Let me save that. And I could go on doing this for a very long time. I mean, there are so many different styles of Vespas and color combinations and little details. It's really up to you how much reference images you want, but I think the more you have, the better. So I'm just going to keep adding these. They're all very interesting. I love this one. That double-seater just makes it super long, and that's really interesting. So I'm going to save that. And the angle that you draw your object at can really change the way that it looks. If I were to draw something just at the profile, the side view of this, it might look pretty flat because there's not much perspective to play with. Whereas if I were to draw it more at like this angle down here, you're going to see a lot more of that depth in the drawing and the final illustration. Alright, so I'm going to go to my profile and find that board. There we go. And this is going to be the collection of everything that I just pinned. And I can now kind of get an overview of all the different angles and think about if I want to pick one of them or maybe look for a few more references. Out of all of these, I think this angle right here is my favorite because you can really see through to where your feet would sit there, and it's got some nice details on the front. You can definitely see that perspective just based on the ground plane here. So I think that's the angle I want to draw it at. And then depending on the style of scooter that I end up drawing, I might want to pull some details from some of these other reference photos. Like I really like this kind of more boxy front plate of this old school Vespa compared to the sleeker design of this one that looks like it's a little bit newer. So maybe I'll take a little bit from that one and make the front plate a little wider, a little bit more boxy. I really love all these little bag holders and things like that, so maybe I'll add some of that detail on. And who knows, maybe I'll even stick a bag on it like this one. This is what the sketching process is for. It allows me to explore all of these ideas very quickly to see if I'm adding too many details, if it's too complex, and not really concern myself with how it's actually being made inside of Illustrator or Photoshop. So I think I'm going to start with this one as my reference and just start sketching. Now, like I said, you do not need to be a professional illustrator to start sketching things for motion graphics designs. And you do not need a ton of expensive tools either. You really just need a pencil and some paper. Now, normally I would be using something like a mechanical pencil because I like the way that the lead is always nice and sharp. It's easy to just extend it out. Once it runs down, it produces really nice and clean lines. But there's nothing wrong with using just a number 2 pencil like this, or some more professional, nicer artist pencils are also great. For this recording though, I'm going to be using a colored pencil because this just shows up so much easier on the recording. So you're going to see my lines a lot better with this kind of blue-purple, violet-blue Prismacolor pencil. Another thing that's really smart to have is a ruler or any kind of straight edge, really. It doesn't have to be a ruler. Like I'm literally going to be using a coffee stir to make straight lines. Whatever you have on hand, it could be a sketchbook, another piece of paper, something like that, just to make straight lines will really help improve the quality of your sketching. So I have my reference image here, and what I want to do is just start breaking it up into its most basic geometric forms. It's really easy to allow your brain to kind of take over what it thinks you should be drawing, what it thinks the object you're trying to draw should look like. But if you just start to think about any object that you're looking at, that you're trying to draw into its most basic geometric forms, you're going to start to see that drawing these types of things are much easier. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to start with the wheels, and I'm just going to draw it pretty big, something like this. And I'm going to do really light, rough lines. I'm not really concerned with how clean this is at this point. From there, I'm going to just take my little straight edge, and I'm going to draw a reference plane, just kind of matching that same angle of the Vespa reference photo. So I'm going to do something like this, just to give me a flat edge so I can kind of match that perspective a little bit better when I go to draw the next wheel. So the next wheel is probably going to go, I'm thinking somewhere around here. And I know we don't even see that much of the wheel, but I'm just going to draw an oval there for the back wheel. Then I'm looking at kind of like the rear components of this, the Vespa. So where you're sitting basically in that entire rear compartment is basically just a box, right? We've got like this geometric box coming off here, cuts off about half of the wheel, and it extends down. So we've kind of got this part that goes down to where your feet rest. I'm just looking for these geometric shapes, something like that. Then we've got a seat on top of that. Comes out a little bit maybe not that far. Then we kind of got like an angled rectangle for this front piece, I can form this out a little bit more. I'm constantly just looking at my reference photo, comparing it to my sketch, and seeing where these main geometric shapes could be. So this looks like it needs to extend and kind of wrap up a little bit this way. Then we've got this cap over the wheel, something like this shape. Just barely touching the top there. And maybe this piece rounds in a little bit. We can refine it a little bit more in a bit. There's the back wheel. And I've got this kind of like boxy shape coming off that back wheel as well. And then let's look at this handlebar. So the thing coming off the top, kind of got a bigger box right here, smaller box for the handles coming off the sides, and then we've got like a light in the middle, and it's kind of an oval shape. We've got our mirrors that extend off the top out this way, one coming off over here, and then this little dome shape that comes off the top of the handlebar. Now do you believe me when I said that I cannot draw? I mean, clearly this is not the same object, but that's okay. It's kind of just like a reference point. I can now look at my sketch and realize that my perspective is pretty off. I was basically just drawing it straight up and down off of that baseline instead of introducing perspective. But now I can go into it a little bit more and start refining these shapes. So this box right here is really a lot more rounded. So it's going to come off more like this. I'm just going to press a little bit harder. And I'm just making these lines a little bit darker so that those basic geometric ones kind of just fade away. I'm not really paying attention to them anymore. But now I can focus on this shape, bring it in a little bit more, closer to the actual reference photo. So I've got something that's much more rounded off here, right? And then this angle comes in. This is where we're going to start to see a little bit more of that perspective. And I don't need to concern myself with making this identical to the actual reference photo. I want this to be stylized. It's going to be a vectorized piece that has a lot of solid colors, so I don't need to worry about making this photorealistic. But I want to see the basic components, making sure those are there so that this is identifiable as a scooter. So that is the important thing. That's what I'm looking out for here. Alright, so there's kind of that area where your feet would go in. I've got the seat up here that I'm going to fill in a little bit darker. Then I'll move on to this shape here and start rounding it off. Just making these curves a little bit nicer. Remember, I like that boxy version of the Vespa, so I'm going to leave that pretty straight edge right here and round off the corners more than anything. Okay, and then we've got the part over the wheel, the dome here. That's going to be rounded on the top. It's kind of got this interesting kind of almost blobby shell shape over the wheel. So something like that. And then we've got the darker wheel here. And this front wheel we can actually see most of. Now, drawing really round shapes like this, like in the real world that tire is perfectly round, it's very difficult to actually draw super round things when you're doing it on paper like this. But one trick that's really helpful is to not draw with your wrist. Instead, drawing with your arm, locking your wrist in one position. And let me show you what I mean. If I try and draw a circle just with my wrist, that was me putting my wrist down on the table and then just trying to draw using my wrist. That wasn't terrible, but if I instead just lightly rest my hand on the page and I move my entire arm from the shoulder all the way down, then I'm going to get something that looks a lot more, not perfect obviously, but a lot more circular. You know, it really can improve the way that your curves are being drawn. So definitely try that technique if you're getting frustrated with really, ugly looking circles like this. If you practice drawing with your entire arm, you're going to get things that look a lot more symmetrical. That being said, I'm not too worried about this because it's very easy to make perfect circles or distorted circles in Illustrator. So I know that that's something I can just perfect once I get there. Alright, I'm going to move on to this part up here, kind of round off these handlebars a little bit too. And make this like a pill shape instead of this boxy shape. Got the headlight and that little dome. And then our handlebars just sticking off the sides. I'll make that nice and dark so it looks like it's actually that dark leather handle. Now these mirrors don't need too much work. They're pretty good. Their basic shapes are just, you know, these ovals coming off these lines, so I'm not too worried about that. But there we go. I think we've got a pretty decent start at a scooter. Basic shapes are there, and it's not half bad. Obviously, perspective is off. That wheel is much smaller than my reference image, but it's someplace to start. I'm not upset that it's not perfect because I don't want it to be a one-to-one representation of any one photo reference. I want to stylize it a little bit. But now that I have one done, I want to just try drawing it again and see if I could add some more details and maybe try some other things to see if I can get something more unique. Alright, so I'm just going to grab another page and I'm going to move this off to the side so I can kind of see it. But then I'm going to think about how I might change this up a little bit. And if you don't know where to start with that, you can think about things like proportions. And I know I just talked about getting proportions correct, but sometimes playing around with proportions can be a lot of fun and make something that looks really unique. So why don't I try and exaggerate the size of the wheels a little bit? Maybe make them really big and see what that does. So I'm going to make another straight line for my reference point. This time I'm going to make it a little less steep. Whoa, that was way off. Here we go. Straight line. Okay, so that's my ground plane, and I'm going to make one wheel really big. The front wheel is really big. And then I'm going to make the back wheel somewhere around here. And then I want to think about how I could kind of incorporate the rest of the elements to exaggerate the size of those wheels. So I'm going to, again, just try and draw. Let's start with the front this time. I'm going to do this kind of hubcap thing. Dome, not a hubcap. Over the top. And then bring this boxy thing up, not quite as much. I want this, again, to be exaggerated based on that wheel size. So something like that. Bring the plate down where your feet go. That kind of runs over half the wheel back here. And then back up and around. Flush that out a little bit more. And then draw that seat. This time I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. Okay. I'll bring this dome shape over here so we get a little bit more of that depth. And then add those handlebars. This time I'm not looking at my reference photo nearly as much. I'm trying to just run wild a little bit and have fun with the sketch and see what kind of a scooter I can draw. I know the basic components at this point. I know, we need a seat, we need the two wheels, and the basic shapes of the actual scooter. So I'm just going to try and have a little bit of fun. Actually, I think I want that wheel to be very visible. So that dome is just going to live a little bit higher. Another reason why the messiness does not matter is because nobody's going to see this but you. This is purely for your reference to bring into Photoshop or Illustrator and perfect there. You don't need to worry about being embarrassed about your sketches, even if somebody does see it. It doesn't matter. It's just a reference drawing for you to explore ideas and try new things. So don't be self-conscious about sketching, because it's just a really great way to get ideas out on the paper, even if you're not happy with the way that your drawing looks. I know I'm not. I've never been one to be proud of my own drawings. But sketching something like this out on paper might surprise you. You might actually come up with something that you like and get it to a point where you're happy enough to take it to the computer and start working digitally, and you'll end up with something that you never would have had if you went straight into Illustrator or Photoshop. Alright, let's finish this guy off. Alright, that's pretty fun. I like that. There are a lot of really basic components that I can see now that will kind of guide me through the actual creation process once I'm in Illustrator. And I'm starting to kind of merge some of these into each other, and it's starting to be a little bit more unique than an actual Vespa, and I really like that. Maybe I'll make my seat a little bit boxier. Alright. Now that that's done, I've got these more exaggerated wheels. We'll compare that to my first sketch. Clearly that's a little bit different, but even just from one sketch to the next, I can already tell I was more confident in drawing the second one that I think ended up being a little bit more clean and unique looking. But I want to try something else now. So I'm going to set both of these aside and grab a new sheet and try another idea. What I want to try this time is drawing everything with straight lines, no curves, and see what happens, just for fun. So let me get that ground plane in there. And then draw really boxy wheels. This might be ridiculous, but I want to see what happens. Alright, so we've got kind of this hubcap thing. I keep calling it a hubcap. It's not a hubcap. Whatever that dome on top of the tire is, that's what I'm talking about. And then I'm just going to kind of follow the angles here. Okay, so there's another option. Something totally wacky. It's a little crazy that I have these kind of like hexagon-shaped or octagon-shaped wheels, but it's interesting, and it got me thinking in new ways. Now that I did one with straight lines, I'm going to try one with all curves, no straight edges or angles at all. Now, if you're getting frustrated when you're sketching and you're having a hard time getting what you see in your head on the page or what you're looking at on the page, it's probably because, again, you're letting your brain tell you what that object should look like. So again, try to take your time. Really look at the details of the object, not the object as a whole, and break it up into its most geometric components, like the wheel, and then making a box for the front of the Vespa, and then the seat is another rectangle that maybe has some extra edges on it. Think about it in those terms, and you're going to start seeing that translate onto the paper a lot more accurately. Alright, so here's my basic wheel. I'm going to put another one roughly here. This time just curves. So I'm going to try doing this little wheel cover. Very blobby shape. Alright, so I have my basic components here of my much more curvy Vespa. I think this feels a lot more cartoony. I actually really like this. I'm happy that I tried this option. Now I'm just going to basically go over it again a little bit darker to try and clean up some of the lines. Alright, I really like the way that this one is looking. I think this piece right here is just bothering me a little bit. Feels a little bit empty. So what if I added a briefcase there, like one of the reference photos that I saw? So let me find that reference photo. Alright, there we go. So it looks like it's just, you know, a box. I'm going to try and keep it in this same curvy style though, but something around here. And to block out that perspective a little bit, get those angles right. Okay. Then I'm going to round off those corners, make this a little darker. And then we've got these grills, or whatever this holder is, holding it in. So I'm going to draw something to fit that as well. Looks like it would come back in this way. If I wasn't using colored pencils, I'd probably try and erase some of these lines, but it doesn't really matter. It's a rough sketch. I know what I'm looking at. That's all that matters. I really like the way that the light is set on this this reference image, so I think I'm just going to kind of build a little bit of a shape into the headlamp on mine. See what that does. Almost looks like an eyeball. It's kind of crazy. Maybe I could rework that once I go to digitally recreate it so that it has that type of a headlamp. I also like the little detail on the back wheel there. Maybe I'll just add a little line. Something that I could easily adjust in Photoshop or Illustrator once I get there. But overall, I'm really happy with that sketch. I love all these curves. I love how cartoony it feels, playful it feels. And when you compare it to the boxy version, I mean, you get a completely different vibe, right? So I think out of these four, this last one is definitely my favorite, and that's not uncommon to enjoy the one that you made last the most. I spent the most time on it. I'd seen enough variation through the other ideas that I explored. I think this is the one I'm going to go with, but because I played through all these different scenarios where I gave myself some restrictions and tried different things, I ended up with something that does not look anything like any one specific reference photo one-to-one, but it's still identifiable as a Vespa. It's just in my own style. Now when you go to do your own sketching, whatever you're trying to draw might have a lot more detail than a Vespa does. And in that case, you need to, again, just think of it in the same process of looking at the object not as a whole, but into its individual geometric components. Start there. Get your basic framework there so you can see if you're getting your proportions right, and if they are looking good, then you can move on to refining them. Draw in a little bit darker, start curving out lines a little bit more, until you end up with something that you think is pretty accurate to what you're looking at. And you can spend as much or as little time on a sketch as you want. I took my time with these because it takes me a little bit of time in thinking about all these different objects to see exactly what I want on the paper. I don't practice drawing that much, so I'm not that fast of a sketcher. You might be, and that's what's great about this process is you can just jump from one sketch to the other. Now, I'm drawing on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. This is a big sketch. I personally like drawing really big like this. I think it gives me a lot more freedom, a lot more breathing room, but there's nothing wrong with just doing little doodles and putting a bunch of sketches on one page. That is one way I could have sped everything up, is just by limiting myself to only drawing in a couple inch square and doing every single one of my versions on the same page. Then I can see them all at once, and I can very quickly just try new things and move on to the next one if I don't like the one that I'm on. And one last tip that I want to give you for drawing is if you're having trouble drawing any lines or curves, if it doesn't feel natural, if you're trying to draw a line in a direction that just doesn't work with the way that your paper is oriented, just rotate it. Always, like my wrist, my right wrist, this is the shape of a natural curve for me. I don't really feel that natural doing curve this direction, so instead I should have just moved this around, flipped it, and then drawn it in the same natural direction. So rotate that paper as much as you need to. Okay, all of that out of the way, I'm now going to take this into the computer, and you can do this with a scanner. If you don't have a scanner, you can take a picture. That's the method I'm going to use. So I'll see you in Illustrator. Actually, before I jump into Illustrator, first I want to do a little bit of tweaking on this photo inside of Photoshop. So this is the picture that I took of my sketch, and I want to clean it up a little bit so that it looks a little bit nicer as I trace it in Illustrator. And I'm going to use a new tool that we haven't used before. The crop tool in Photoshop literally just lets you crop your image however you want. So I could crop this down as a square, no problem, hit the check mark, and there we go. My canvas size has been cropped to the size of my selection. But there's another tool that is underneath this tool called the Perspective Crop tool, and this is the specific one I want. Because I have this nice grid in the background, I can very easily correct for any kind of perspective distortion that I had with my camera. If I tilted it at all, it would be off. This looks like it's pretty good. I would be fine just transferring it into Illustrator as is, but if your photos are off a little bit, you can use this, whether you use the corners of your page or a nice grid in the background like I have. All you have to do is drag a selection around the area that you're going to be lining up to, and then I'm going to just correct for this perspective right about here. It doesn't have to be perfect. Anything that I do in the vicinity of those actual points, as long as those lines are parallel, this should work out pretty well. Now that I've corrected all of those corners, all I have to do is hit the check mark, and it automatically rotates and corrects any perspective issues. Then I can take my regular crop tool, drag a regular selection around here, make it nice and tight, and apply the crop. Alright, so now I know that that perspective is great and it's isolated to just the sketch, but my background is not pure white. It's just that paper color, and if I made it pure white, it would be easier to look at in Illustrator. So I'm going to use another trick using curves. The shortcut for this is Command M. I'm not worried about being non-destructive because I'm not doing anything extravagant here in Photoshop. I just want to correct this brightness a little bit, so applying curves directly to this image is totally fine. All I want to do is bring the whites up so that I get rid of all of that paper color. It basically makes everything in the background pure white, and then I'm going to grab my darks and darken that up a little bit so those lines are nice and dark. There we go. That's all I wanted to do. Click OK. And now I could save this as a JPEG and import it into Illustrator, but there's actually an easier way. All I have to do is say Command A to select all, copy with Command C, jump into Illustrator. I'll make a new document, 1920 by 1080. Web large preset is good, and then paste. And just like that, I'm able to transfer a selection, a copied selection from Photoshop to Illustrator. So I'm just going to scale this down, align it to the center of my document, and there we go. I've got my Vespa sketch right inside of Illustrator ready to trace. I'm going to rename this layer reference, lock it, and make a new one for my actual vector tracing. Now before I actually do any of that tracing, I first want to explore some styles. I want to look online and see how some other artists have approached different vector styles to see if there's something that piques my interest. Because the style that I go with might determine the way that I create the artwork. I don't want to start making something and then decide, oh, you know what, I'd rather do it in this style, which requires different shapes. So I'm going to jump back online and see if I can find some references. I'm going to start searching here on Dribbble. This is a great website for finding vector artwork, and I think we'll be able to find some pretty good styles. So I'm just going to search for Vespa and see what comes up. So okay, I'm going to zoom in on this one. This one's pretty cool. This one has a lot of little subtle details, a lot of shading to help it feel a lot more realistic. That's pretty cool. It is straight on from the profile view. That was something I was trying to stay away from, but that's not exactly what I'm looking for here. I'm pretty much just looking at the artistic direction. So there's one option. This one's pretty cool. Very simple shapes. It's very, very simplified. I think I actually want to save this one, so I'm going to right click and say Save on Pinterest, and then put that on my Vespa board just so I can reference it. And then take a look at some more. This one is extremely simple, and this one's even animated. That's fun. But you can see this is really, really simplified. So that's pretty cool. This one has really bold strokes. This is cool. It even has tapered strokes. That's a very unique direction. A lot of times you see very uniform strokes with vector artwork. Everything is the same size, or every stroke is the same size. But this is much more unique. It looks really cool. So I'm going to save that as a reference too. Alright, let's see what else we can find. This one is a lot of fun. It has some texture to it, some really nice organic looking elements. I'm going to save that. I think that might be a really fun style to kind of do mine in. And I didn't have to search for Vespa either. I could have just browsed through Dribbble and looked at any artwork. But I just figured searching for Vespa I could see more direct applications or references for what I'm trying to do. This one I don't even see a Vespa in. Let me open up the full-size version. Oh, there you go. Okay, so they're on like a scooter. I love the artistic direction on this one. The way that all these textures on the edges with the shading and everything, that is really cool. I don't know if I can replicate it exactly, but I really, really like that style. So I'm going to save that as possibly a direction I'll go. And then I saw one more down here. This one also has some really nice gritty texture. That's a lot of fun. It almost looks like a stippling effect. I'm going to save that. Check this one out. Talk about simplified. I mean, yeah, that's literally an icon. So that would be, I mean, that's a perfect example of when you would want to do something in a straight-on profile view like that. It absolutely works as an icon in that style. Here's one that has those mono-width strokes. So this is in stark contrast to the one that had all those varying widths. I'm going to save that just for reference. I like those colors a lot. And then we have this one here that's very artistically shaded. Oh, and look, this is by Tyler Morgan, the husband of Sarah Beth Morgan, who we talked to on the podcast. He's an excellent animator. And the way that he's got these grainy textures for the highlights and the shadows brings this to life. I mean, without those textures, without that shading, these are just flat shapes. So that's a really great example. I'm going to save that. And then check this one out. This is more at the angle that I'm creating mine at, and it has just these really kind of free-form paths. They're not very perfect at all. It looks way more hand-done and organic, and I really like that style. And you can see how this artist interpreted that depth with the shading and just the way that she created these the shapes that make up this object. So I think that's a perfect one for reference. All right, I think I have enough. And again, I could spend lots of time doing just this over and over again, looking at all the different textures, the different styles, but I've got to decide what I want mine to be. So I'm going to jump back onto Pinterest real quick, find that board, and take a look at everything that I just pinned. I think out of everything that I've looked at so far, I'm liking the ones that don't have the darkest strokes. So something like this and this one here, as opposed to something like this. I do like the simplified nature of this one, but I don't think that's the direction I want to go with mine. I think I want to go with one that's a little bit more like this, with potentially some textures like we see in here. Maybe I'll add that in Photoshop, or maybe I'll just play around with the textures inside of Illustrator and see if I can come up with some kind of gradient for the highlights and shadows like this one. But with that in mind, I'm basically going to create my object with just basic paths, not worrying about strokes so much. Now, I've already shown you my process of tracing a sketch with the pen tool, so I'm going to skim through a little bit of this, but I'm going to start with the bigger shapes probably first and just work my way around the entire object, not worrying too much about color, and just try and recreate exactly what I have in my sketch. And you'll probably notice that my paths are not going to line up exactly with my sketch. I'm probably going to smooth some things out, maybe modify some things, so that in the end I have something that's a little bit more cleaned up than my hand-drawn sketch. Also, just be aware that anything that's sped up here is something I've covered in previous lessons. So you know how to do everything I'm doing in these sped up sections, and anything that you don't know how to do, I will explain. Okay, so there's my initial trace, which I did end up doing pretty much exactly like my sketch. So the next step for me is to go through here, start adding colors and cleaning up the paths wherever I think they need to be cleaned, or potentially just reshaping them altogether. And I think I'm going to go for more of this free-form path look, so I'm actually, in this particular style, not going to worry too much if I need to bend my paths so that they're not perfectly horizontal. I'm just going to do whatever I need to do in order to get the shapes that I want. And I'm just going to start by filling it all with white so I can kind of layer the objects the way that I want them to. Some of them obviously don't need fills, like these lines here. I'm going to take that off. But this way I don't see through this object behind it, and the wheel can be tucked up just a little bit behind this one. So I'm going to just rearrange these objects, and I can bring objects forward or backward by holding down Command and pressing the left or right bracket. Again, this is going to be much more easy to see inside of the Layers palette. If I press the up bracket, you can see that path moving up and down. Or I could press Command Shift right bracket, and that's going to send it all the way to the top. Command Shift left bracket, send it all the way back. So I'm just going to shift that up to the top. That's pretty much the most forward object, so that's fine to be up at the top. Another thing I want to do is distort these wheels a little bit. I created them with perfect ovals, but if I select both of them and go underneath the scale tool, there's a tool called the shear tool, and this lets you just freely kind of distort the angle that the object is resting at. So I just want to kind of shift it over to the right a little, and you know what, I'm going to do it at the same time as the other wheels so that this is also sheared in the same angle. So this works just like the scale tool where you set your anchor point and then it shears based on that point. So that's right in the middle. I'm going to just click and drag while holding Shift to just warp these over just a little bit. And that way they're now at a little bit of an angle. They're not perfectly formed ovals. They've got a little bit of a slant to them. And I realize I said I'm not going to worry about the strokes, but this way, just looking at them with strokes, I can focus on the form of the shapes and not so much the color. I'll worry about the color in a little bit. I feel like I'm losing my original shape on this this little wheel well, so I'm actually just going to turn everything off except that path and then my original sketch, because I really do like the shape that I had for that one. For whatever reason, that shape just feels very unique. I like it, so I'm going to try and match it again. So I'm going to just remodify this path until it fits my sketch a little bit more closely. Okay, now I'm going to start playing with some colors. My paths aren't final at all, but the basic form is there, so I want to start playing with the actual styling of this graphic so that it starts working its way towards what I want the final to be. And as I'm kind of developing this look, I'm literally just playing around with things. You can see that I'm starting to add some width into these strokes using the stroke width tool, just giving some variation in the stroke width so that it feels a little less vectory. I mean, it is still obviously vector, it's clean, but it's not so monoline, so singular width. And I think that's going to add a lot of character to this piece overall. And I definitely think I can use this technique to kind of divide up some of the objects. Like I want this to be separate from the handlebars. So what I'm going to do is first change the color of this layer so it's actually something I can see. But I'm going to copy this path right here, just selecting that anchor point, direct selecting it. Then I'll copy and paste in front, Command F. And that's just going to paste the portion of the path on either side of that anchor point. So it only goes to the next anchor point on each side. I don't even need that much of it. I'll probably trim it off maybe about here and here, and then get rid of the remaining portions of the path. And then I want to add a stroke to it that has a little bit less brightness than the red that it currently is. So I'm going to just drop the brightness down a little bit on that, and then scale up the width in the middle here, make the ends round caps, and then just play around with this a little bit more. And if you don't know what this stroke width tool is that I'm using, make sure you go watch the bonus lesson on day 2 for more stroke options where I cover exactly how this tool works. Alright, now I want to break off the handlebars, the actual grips from the handlebars, so that I can make them a different color. And to do that, I'm going to copy and paste this in front, so I have 2 copies of it, and then I'm going to take just my pen tool and kind of draw where I want this to be cut. It doesn't need to be aligned, it actually just needs to overlap. Then I'll select both that object and the duplicate, come to my Pathfinder under Appearance. Actually, it's not even showing up, so I'm going to go to Window, Pathfinder, and then I just want to make sure that I take the fill off of that path that I drew on top of it. So I'm going to kind of use that as a slice, a cut for the other paths. I'll just click on Divide, and now this object is grouped, but it's in 2 different shapes. So I'm going to ungroup with Command-Shift-G, and I have just this shape, and I can make it the color I wanted. And then with the remaining piece, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to draw a path around the portion that I want to be left there. I'll make sure that that fill is gone, and then I'm just going to select that empty path and the duplicate, divide that out, ungroup, delete the middle part, and then just color this the way that I wanted it to. I really like the way that these variable width strokes are coming into play, so I think I'm just going to add them to a few more select spots just to give a little bit extra detail, a little bit more flair. But I really like the way that this style has just kind of developed out of me playing around with it. Okay, I'm really liking the way this is shaping up, but I think I want to add some more depth to the wheels. So I'm going to grab both of those, hold down Option, and then click and drag so that I have a second copy of each of them, and send those to the back. That's Command-Shift left bracket. Then I'm going to make them the same darkness as this kind of highlight or shadow color. And there we go. Now I've got a little bit of depth. Just want to modify these paths so that they fit the actual contour of that tire a little bit better. There we go. Now we've got a little bit of depth there. Maybe I can make that even a little more extreme. Very nice. Then I think I'm going to rotate this up just a little bit and maybe just warp it out with the scale tool so we can see a little bit of the top of the tire. Because in the original reference photo you really could see that. So I'm going to make sure that's directly behind the other shape. Command B to paste behind. And then you can kind of see that top of the tire just peeking out there underneath this shape. I'm going to continue with this, just adding a little bit of shading on some of these objects. The tire would probably have a shadow. So I'm just going to make a basic shape like that and then fill it with this darker color and then just cut the object and make sure to paste it right behind this object, which would be casting that shadow. Then maybe I'll just try playing with the opacity. Turn that down to say like 40-ish. And there we go, we got a little bit of a shadow, and I'll do the same thing on the well here, or this little tire cover thing. Might even be able to just copy this path and make a shape based off of that. So I'll just take this segment that I copied, box it off, and then drop it down a little bit, the whole thing. Make it that same color, the same opacity, cut, paste behind, and then just modify the path until it isn't visible where it shouldn't be. And in this case, I think I'm going to use a clipping mask, which to do this in Illustrator, all I need to do is grab the object that I want to contain my other shape within. So in this case, I want this shadow to only go on top of the inside of the tire here. So I'm going to copy this object. Then I'll double click on my shadow so that I isolate it, and I'll paste in front. I'll grab both of those objects and go up to Object, Clipping Mask, Make. Shortcut is Command 7. Much simpler that way. But now my shadow is contained within that object. I can get out of isolation mode, and there we go. I've got a shadow. And I can modify this with the Direct Selection tool as much as I want. So I just want a little bit of a shadow there, but it's never going to go outside that tire now. Unless I modify the actual tire, not the clipping mask tire. I will then have to update the clipping mask. So that is something to be aware of. But there we go. We got a nice little shadow there. Okay, I think I'm going to call that good. I'm now just going to put in some colored background so that I have kind of a finished piece here. So I'm just going to make a rectangle, send it to the back, and then make it, I don't know, something based on this red color. Turn down the saturation, maybe adjust the hue a little bit, making sure that all my other objects are pretty visible through this. Just something like that, a nice off-white. And then I think I'm going to add like a ground plane, kind of like it's going over a little hill. And I'll use this same kind of variable width stroke that I've been doing, just to give it a little bit more consistency there. And rotate it so that it matches my tires. What happened here? I think I sent it to the background. Yep. There we go. We got a line. And maybe that's not the right color. Maybe I'll make it the same shade as my background, but then just darken it. Maybe increase the saturation a little. There we go. And then I'm just going to bump up the stroke. Alright, I think I'm going to call it there. Obviously I could play around with the details all day long and continue to modify this to death, but I'm really happy with the way that it turned out, considering that I went from this little sketch by hand. Remember, this is what it looked like, and I went through iterations of 4 different versions of this. I've been ending up with something that looks like this. I feel like it's a very unique style, new to me even. I don't think I've ever done something quite like this before, and I'm just really pleased with the way that it all turned out. So I don't think I'm going to go into Photoshop. I don't really feel like I need to add any of that painterly texture or anything to it. Just the way that this shaping up inside of Illustrator, I think looks great. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully you got something out of that journey where I was able to just work through those sketches, look through references, try my hand at drawing, which I'm not very good at, but then end up with something like this that's very playful, cartoony, and unique. And I love that process. So I hope that you got something out of that.